The 2026 regulations have been presented to the F1 world, and it seems like the drivers have mixed feelings when it comes to whether or not there'll be an improvement for the sport. Although the FIA has taken a drastic approach and is returning to the 2000s vibes with the new cars, the weight as well as some other components like the size of the cars were still brought into question. With this in mind, how do the F1 drivers feel about the new regulations, and more importantly, can they urge the FIA to change something about them? After the new regulations came out yesterday, the F1 media had a unique chance to talk them through with the drivers during the press conference of the Canadian GP. But before we go with the comments of drivers like Hamilton, who's driven in a couple of different eras in his career, let's see what the regulations hold in themselves. One of the most noticeable differences is the car's size, as now we'll have cars with a nimble concept, with the total mass of the Challengers dropping for 30 kilos. On top of that, the maximum wheelbase will shrink by 200mm, the width of the car will also narrow by 100mm, and the maximum floor width will be reduced by 150mm. The size of the wheels will remain the same, 18 inches, but the width of the front tyres will be reduced by 25mm on the front and 30mm on the rear tyres. A lot has changed in the aero department, with the most important one being the DRS system being out of the picture. This is something that granted teams like Red Bull around 30 kilometers per hour of speed once they were able to open the flap on the rear wing, and instead of that, the 2026 cars will have two modes, Z and X. The Z mode will tend to have higher downforce, while the X mode will open up the front wing and create a low drag environment for the car in order to increase straight line speed. A lot has been worked on the outwash that has disturbed the following cars, and as of now it seems like the 2026 cars will have mandated pieces of bodywork that would in-was the airflow and promote closer racing. The floors will also see massive change due to the fact that the downforce requirements won't be as big as the ones we're currently experiencing, which means that they will be mostly flat. This was to be expected given the fact that the total amount of downforce will reduce by 30%, while the total amount of drag is expected to reduce by a staggering 55%. And of course, we came to the engine, something that Hamilton feels is an area that is yet to be improved due to the initial tests being run in the simulators. As of now, the power split between the ICE or the internal combustion engine as well as the MGUK or the electrical power that the car is receiving through the boost of the battery will be 50-50. Compared to the current era, this is a massive change because now it's 80-20, and that comes with a lot of other changes as well. The total power that the ICE will deliver to the car will reduce to 400 kilowatts from the 550 to 560 kilowatt that it delivered now. On top of that, the MGUK's power will increase from 120 kilowatts to 350 kilowatts, marking a massive enhancement of 3 times the current power that this element provides to the cars. It's what brought teams like Audi and Ford into the sport from 2026 onwards, along with the fully sustainable fuels, and it's what kept Honda as well as the Japanese manufacturers kind of reluctant as to whether the sport was moving in the right direction for their liking. However, there are still lots of improvements to be made, and when talking about this, Lewis Hamilton feels like the cars are still too slow, partially because they've invested too much in the electrical part of generating power and not the classical ICE one. Elaborating on this matter to a bigger extent, Hamilton said, "I've spoken to some drivers who have driven the 2026 car in the simulator. Me personally, I still haven't, but they said it is pretty slow. So we will see whether it is actually the right direction or not. But I think in terms of sustainability, particularly on the power unit side, I think that is a really bold step, and I think that is going in the right direction. We just have to make sure that the cars are efficient, fast, and a natural step forward, and actually racing is improved." What is also worth mentioning is that the energy recovery has been doubled under braking, and from 2026 onwards, the cars will regenerate around 8.5 mJ per lap. On top of that, there will be a manual override mode that the drivers could activate, and that would taper the recovered energy deployment of a leading car after it reaches speeds of 290 kilometers per hour, dropping it to zero at 355 kilometers per hour, while the following car will benefit from the MGUK override that would provide 350 kilowatts up to 337 kilometers kilometers per hour, as well as the extra 0.5 mJ of energy. Still, all of this feels like a bit too much calculation and forcing something that doesn't feel that natural to the teams and the drivers. Alex Albon has also opened up on the regulation changes, and the narrative from the Thai driver was the same. The car is going to be too slow, and the racing factor, although being improved, would likely come at a huge cost to the speed of the cars. Talking about this more, Albon said, "We've had our sim guys do some work, but I myself haven't done anything. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think it's going to be very, very slow. I guess there is a lot of stuff being done around making sure that the straight line speeds are not tapering off at the end, with all the MGUK and whatnot being involved. I still think there needs to be some work done, but seeing some of the speed traces around the tracks, it's pretty slow." Whenever a new regulation cycle comes in, the question arises as to whether or not it would be a pure replacement of the current dominance led by Verstappen and Red Bull with another one, and that is a question that the FIA would have to answer on their own. What we can agree on is that the new regulations are definitely pushing towards closer racing and more overtaking by making the cars narrower and lighter, but by reducing the amount of downforce and the weight still being a huge issue, the fact that the drivers would still feel a big chunk of the crash on their own bodies remains the same. Just because the FIA mandated that the cars should be 30 kilos lighter doesn't mean that the teams would be automatically able to achieve that limit. Just look at what happens right now with Alpine, and look at what happened with Red Bull and Ferrari in the beginning of the 2022 era, when they were stripping off paint in order to gain minimal fractions of weight out of the car. When talking about this, Verstappen had a bit more of an optimistic view actually when it comes to the 30 kilo shed that the 2026 cars will witness. He went on to say, "At the moment, achieving the target weight reduction is going to be very tough with how everything is. Even now, some teams are overweight, so to go even 30 kilograms less, I know the dimensions of the cars change a little bit, but losing 30 kilos would be the perfect scenario for a team in 2026, let's say that." And at the end of the day, it's close racing and domination that are the primary questions that we're coming to. And according to the now former Chief Technical Officer from Red Bull, Adrian Newey, the new regulations are made to satisfy one or two new manufacturers on the grid that will have engine supremacy over the other teams. Obviously, we've seen other teams taking over the regulations in 2010, when the aerodynamics of the car were the most important part of it. In 2014, it was Mercedes who dominated with the turbo hybrid era, and in 2022, of course, it was Red Bull again who managed to build a car with a floor so complex that it took other teams 2 years to understand. Newey feels like a similar scenario will happen in 2026, as he went on to say, "The FIA seems to have been heavily influenced by one or two manufacturers, hoping to please them, but also to attract others. The reality is that manufacturers come and go, with the exception of Ferrari. It is the teams that drive the business, and the great attraction is the public. It is essential that we offer them a good show, and part of that variety is well rewarded." With all this in mind, what do you think about the new 2026 regulations? Let us know in the comments below.